So to have a powerful framework for understanding anything, you basically have to answer two questions. First, what is its purpose? Why does this thing exist? And second, who are the participants? Once you can answer these two questions clearly, you'll be in a much better position to understand the behavior of whatever it is that you're studying. And in this case, what we're studying is the markets. And answering these two questions will give us a great framework for how the markets really work and how we can take advantage of their movements. So, getting to the first question, what is the purpose of the market? And if we had to answer at the most basic level, that answer would be that the purpose of the market is to facilitate trade. If you look at any market, a physical exchange like the New York Stock Exchange or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, or an electronic one like the NASDAQ, the sole and primary purpose of these markets is to facilitate trade, is to allow the transfer, the buying and the selling of shares or contracts. That's why they're there, that's why they exist. And knowing that, we can come to a certain conclusion. And that is that they must be governed by the laws of supply and demand. Whenever you have trade facilitation taking place, supply and demand are at play. So that's the first key concept right now we have of understanding the markets. The second question was, who are the participants? And if you look at the marketplace and you forget all the squiggly lines you see on the charts and all the patterns people tell you about, in essence, when you look at who are the participants, what do those charts really mean? Who is behind them? And the simple answer is that the participants of the marketplace are human beings. Yes, you see all those charts and those seemingly chaotic moving prices, but in the end, what's behind the movement of these prices are human beings. Now, some people will say that half of the volume these days in the markets are machines, are computer programs and algorithms. Yes, that's true, but even those are programmed by human beings. And not only are they programmed by human beings, they are also run by human beings. The decisions for when to turn them off and on are run by human beings. And once you get this clear point, this seemingly simple point, you can draw another conclusion. Human beings have a distinct, observable psychological and emotional makeup, and they are also creatures of habit. And as creatures of habit, we all have repeatable patterns of behavior and thinking in our lives. And so when you put these two answers together, the why the market exists and who are the participants, you can come to some broad conclusions about what makes prices move and how markets behave and why they behave the way they do. And really, it becomes the interplay of supply demand and human psychology. Those are the two main things that come together to influence prices. And once you have this framework that includes both these things, that includes these fundamental concepts, then you're in a position to understand how the market truly works. And so with that, let's take an example to show you how these two concepts play out in the real world using a simple marketplace before we dive into the financial markets, which are a bit more complex. And so let's take a simple real world example that we can all understand. The price of bread, for instance. Let's assume you have a bread producer and he's selling bread, but he wants to find out what is the true price that he should be selling this bread at. For instance, maybe he's pricing it too low. He's selling all his inventory, but maybe he could get a higher price and still sell. So to find out what the true price of his bread should be, he raises the price. He tries raising it. And as he raises the price, maybe he sells a little less bread because now the price is higher and people find it a bit too expensive. But he's still selling quite a bit of bread, and since he's getting a higher price for that bread that he's selling, it's still worth it for him. So he decides, okay, let me raise it a little higher. And now he sells a little less bread, but he's still making good money again because of the higher price. And so to find out, the maximum price he can possibly charge, he naturally has to keep raising the price of bread to find out what that price is. And at some point, as he keeps raising the price of bread, the buying will shut off. The buying will get to a level, right, where the price of bread is too high and people think it's too expensive and they'll buy a lot less. Well, at that point, he's not selling enough bread, and to do so, he has to decrease the price. So he's basically found that price ceiling for his bread, and he needs to decrease it again to get back to the point where he can sell his bread. And that point is called the value point, or the point at which trade facilitation can occur. Right? When it was too high, he couldn't sell enough bread. So he brings it back down to a point where he sees it as value based on his experimenting with the price. So now let's assume the flip side. Let's assume he has far too much inventory one month and he needs to get rid of it. Well, the only way to do so is to drop the price of the bread. And as he drops the price of the bread, he gets more buying. But he still has inventory and he needs to get rid of it, so he drops it even further. Well, he keeps doing that till we get to a point where the price of the bread has dropped so low that people see it as a great deal or a great offer and they scoop it all up. At that point, he's gotten rid of all his inventory, and now he can raise the price of bread once again to its normal true value, right? And in this instance, this is simple supply and demand. As he raised the price, demand became less, right? And he couldn't get rid of all of his supply. And in instances when he had a lot of supply and he needed to get rid of it, he decreased the price. This increased the demand to meet the supply. So this is simple economics, but this is exactly the law that governs trade facilitation. And this law also governs how the markets will work, as we will find out in following sessions. It's a little more complex in the markets, but it's still the same law nonetheless. Now, the other thing we talked about when we were answering those two questions is who are the participants. And like we said, the participants are human beings. And human beings are creatures of habit, and they're also emotional creatures. We're all driven by fear and hope and greed and the other emotions that human beings experience. And so let's see how this plays out in the bread example. Let's assume that a rumor comes out that this bread maker does not have enough supplies for this month. Okay? And now what are people going to do? Think about the normal human emotional reaction. If bread is seen as a very important commodity in their lives, and there's a rumor that there's not going to be enough bread this month, whether that rumor is true or not, fear is going to set in. And people are going to run to the bread maker, and they're going to want to buy bread. And not only are they going to want to buy bread, they'll probably buy more than they need to kind of save up due to that fear. And then what also happens, an interesting phenomenon, is that other people who may not have been so much influenced see these people acting in fear. And this fear now becomes contagious. When you see other people fearful, you become fearful yourself. It's a natural human reaction. And so now these people run to buy bread too. And it spreads. It's like a knock-on spiral effect that spreads. And this is what's called crowd behavior. And this is what happens when you get these mass emotions of people in play. And so these people run to this bread maker, they scoop up all of his inventory, and him seeing this realizes, hey, this is a much higher demand than usual. I can probably raise the price of this bread and still get rid of it. And so he does. And so now the price of the bread has gone up and the demand is still there nonetheless. And yet none of the supply demand fundamentals had actually changed. He hadn't actually had a bread shortage. But people's perception of it was that he had bread shortage. And so what we realize now when we bring the human psychology element into the mix is that human psychology also affects prices. It's not just the demand-supply equation. And once you realize this, you come up with this final framework. You have supply and demand, and you have human psychology, and these two connect and interplay to finally give you price behavior. If you're trying to look at the markets as a purely rational place that's only governed by economics, you are going to be very disappointed and surprised by the actions you see in the market. Sometimes certain supply and demand economics point to one thing, and yet you get very different price action. And the reason for that is you have to factor in human psychology, the fear and the greed and other things that happen. And it's not just human psychology. Obviously, sometimes certain supply demand fundamentals are going to affect price. No matter the fear, no matter the greed, eventually you get to a point where certain intrinsic value of something kicks in. And no matter how fearful people are, then the real value players will come and start scooping things up based on their intrinsic value. So these are the two major concepts that, when put together, are going to allow you to understand the market at a much deeper level. And once you have this deeper understanding, you're going to be able to understand the patterns, to decipher them better, and to ultimately trade them better. And that's what we're going to move to next when we discuss how these things play out in the financial markets.